The final approach that you need to know about is the humanist approach. And it is slightly different to the other approaches that we've looked at in that it doesn't have one key concept which explains how humans behave in the way that they do. Instead, the humanist approach suggests that you have to be holistic in the way that you look at an individual. You have to look at all possible factors, and that is the only way that you can explain behaviour. There isn't one particular individual cause. However, there are some themes which run through all humanist thinking. The first of the common features is this idea of free will. And this is a concept which says that everybody has the right to choose, or everybody has the ability to choose the behaviour that they want to display. So even though sometimes our choices may be limited, we choose to do something maybe in line with laws or rules, we still could choose to break them if we wanted to. So even though we may have limited options, ultimately we choose what we want to do, and the responsibility for our behaviour is ours. The second idea is this idea of holism, which is the idea that unlike with maybe the behaviourist approach or the biological approach, the humanists suggest that we can't break a complex thing like behaviour down into individual parts, that looking at just one of those components doesn't make sense in understanding behaviour, and that if you do want to understand behaviour, you need to look at a variety of different experiences and link them together in order to explain it. This does mean that each explanation is individual to one person. So there is no one explanation which would explain why everybody behaves in a particular way. This also means that you would never have things like the humanist explanation for depression, because humanists would never imagine that one person's explanation for depression would be the same as another person's explanation. The third thing that's common among humanist thinking is this idea that scientific measurement is inappropriate. So humans are subjective, we're irrational, we're illogical, and science is the opposite of all of those things. So humanists would argue that science is therefore inappropriate to measure or to try and understand human behaviour. The fourth concept is the idea of self-actualization. Now, humanists would say that the goal of human existence is to reach our potential, and that's what they term to self-actualize. So humans naturally want to better themselves, and there are two different ways that we're going to look at, two different theories about how self-actualization could occur. Now, two different humanists have suggested two different ways that we can reach self-actualization. The first one by Maslow is looking at a hierarchy of needs, and the second one by Rogers is looking at different forms of the self and creating congruence between those forms. So Maslow's idea about how we would reach self-actualization is based on this hierarchy of needs. So he created this pyramid, and at each level our needs have to be met, and provided our needs are being met at each level, then we can reach self-actualization, which is at the top. So looking at these needs then, the first level is about physiological needs. So that's things like food, oxygen, sleep. So we'd need to not be hungry, not be sleep deprived. Provided all those needs are being met, we can look up at the next level, which is safety. Safety is looking at things like security, protection, stability. So, for example, if your financial situation is very stable, you don't have money worries, then you might say that all of your safety needs are being met. The next level up is about love and belonging, and this is about relationship. So Maslow said we have relationship needs, and those needs could be met from partners, from friends, from family, but we have to have that sense of love and belonging. The level just below self-actualization is esteem, and this is things like status, self-respect, your own perception of your competence. So Maslow suggested that if all of these needs were being met, then self-actualization could occur. Now, this does mean it's not a permanent state. So it could be that if one of those needs were suddenly not being met for some reason, maybe you break up with a partner, you would then no longer be self-actualized, but you could return to that state once those needs had been met again. Rogers was a second humanist and he had an idea that we had 3 different selves, and those selves had to be congruent or together in order for self-actualization to occur. So the first self that Rogers proposed was the self-concept, and this is how we see ourselves. So do we see ourselves as someone who's worthwhile, someone who's competent? What character traits do we think we have? All of that went together to form your self-concept. The second self was the ideal self. So this is the self that we want to be. So are there maybe personality traits we wish we did have? Were there capabilities that we wish we had that we didn't have? All of that forms the ideal self. And the last self is the real self. And this one is the one that's very, very hard to determine, because it's very difficult to create a picture of the real self that isn't subjective in some way. If the real self comes from you, then it's going to be drawn from the self-concept. If it comes from somebody else, it's going to be drawn from their perceptions of you, which aren't necessarily realistic. So if all of those things were the same, so our self-concept, our ideal self and our real self, if they were all the same, then Rogers would say we had congruence. And in order to reach congruence, Rogers suggested we needed to have unconditional positive regard. Now, unconditional positive regard, to explore this a little bit further, is the idea that we shouldn't have in our lives hundreds and hundreds of conditions of worth. So a condition of worth is something which says, in order to be valued or in order to be loved, I have to do X, or I have to be something. And we all have these, but unconditional positive regard is the opposite of this. It's the idea that you are valued despite anything you may think or do or achieve. And Rogers thought that this was really important in achieving congruence, and then once you'd achieved congruence, you could self-actualize. So although the humanist approach hasn't developed theories in the way we've been looking at them throughout the psychology course, it has still been influential, particularly in counselling and client-centred therapy. So in client-centred therapy, the therapist will offer unconditional positive regard to the client, and this will enable the client to feel comfortable enough to be honest in the sessions, and then any barriers to self-actualization can be explored. So before coming into the lesson, you need to make sure that you can outline the key features of humanist thinking, explain why we don't have humanist theories for explaining behaviours, explain how Maslow suggested we reach self-actualization, and then also explain how Rogers suggested we reach self-actualization, and then finally explain what impact the humanist approach has had on psychology. You can look back through this video as many times as you like, or you can go to the pre-reading and explore all of these concepts in a little bit more depth.